Today, the biggest drop in living standards in many decades. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and prop news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Well, today I'm going to talk specifically about the UK mini-budget, which was given overnight, because there are some profound implications. But before I do that, I will just touch on the Dow, which ended flat after climbing late into the close on Thursday, as investors weighed up further remarks from Federal Reserve officials who were calling for more rate hikes, stoking concerns about a deeper recession. In fact, the Dow Jones Industrial Average ended flat, or by 7 points actually, and the Nasdaq fell 0.35% and the S&P 500 fell 0.3%. The St. Louis Federal Reserve President James Bullard insisted that rate hikes need to be increased further to reach a sufficiently restrictive level to cool inflation. Bullard, who tends to lean hawkish, suggested the Fed's benchmark rate would need to rise to at least 5%, maybe to 5.25%, or even more, to curb inflation. And so commodities from oil to copper fell, while the dollar snapped a two-day drop. The US dollar was stronger in the end. The DXY was up 0.37% to 106.67. A key part of the Treasury yield curve, the 10-year yield over the 2-year, inverted further, a key recession indicator, that's by the most since 2019. With inflation only starting to ease and a gauge of US retail sales increasing at the fastest pace in 8 months, Fed speakers in recent days have emphasised that they need to go further to extinguish price pressures. Bullard's comments came just a day after San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly said a pause in rate hikes was off the table. Their hawkish tone was echoed by Minneapolis Fed President Neil Kashari on Thursday afternoon. The takeaway is that the Fed is following the same playbook they have now for a long time, said Joan Gran, head of ETFs at Alliance Investment Management. Fed Chair Jerome Powell persistently reiterates his hawkish stance to keep markets at bay, so the rally after softer inflation data was not what central bank officials wanted to see, he said. It's a game of chicken between basically the economy, the markets and the Fed right now, Graham said. And most people, I think, would be wise to believe that the Fed might win in the end. On Thursday, fresh data showing weekly jobless claims came in below the forecast, further underscored the strength of the labour market. We had thought that last week's increase might have been the start of a gradual move to higher levels, but there was no follow-through this week. Instead, claims remained in the historically low range that has held since mid-August, Jeffries said in a note. US mortgage rates posted their biggest weekly decline since 1981, briefly improving sentiment, even though Freddie Mac's chief economist said there's a long road ahead for the housing market. But in fact, this was because Freddie Mac has changed their methodology rather than it being a market-driven change. And the European Central Bank policymakers, too, are said to be mulling a smaller 50 basis point rate hike next month, signalling their concern for the economy and pushing the euro lower. But now in the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, laid bare a very bleak new reality for the UK economy on Thursday. It's one plagued by weak growth and rising taxes for years to come.
So today we deliver a plan to tackle the cost of living crisis and rebuild our economy. Our priorities are stability, growth and public services. We also protect the vulnerable, because to be British is to be compassionate, and this is a compassionate Conservative government. We are not alone in facing these problems, but today we respond to an international crisis with British values. We are honest about the challenges and we are fair in our solutions. Yes, we take difficult decisions to tackle inflation and keep mortgage rates down. But our plan also leads to a shallower downturn, lower energy bills, higher growth, and a stronger NHS and education system.
The pound dropped after he outlined a £55 billion package of tax rises and spending cuts, even as the economy is sliding into a recession. Gilt yields rose, with the 2-year up 0.31% to 3.1095, while the 10-year rose to 0.59% to 3.2180, and the FTSE ended flat at 7,346. Pinned in by a toxic combination of recession, investor scepticism, and the sharpest squeeze in living standards since records began 66 years ago, Hunt pieced together tax hikes and spending cuts in a bid to stabilise public finances. Under Hunt's plan, the tax burden on Britons is set to soar to 37.1% of GDP. That's the highest level since World War II. And a lot of the heavy lifting is being done by freezing tax bands, meaning as inflation rages higher, more people pay more tax or are pulled into the tax system. The UK is in the grip of the sharpest drop in living standards on record. But he delayed the brunt of austerity for 2 years in a bid to lend the troubled economy and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's ruling Conservatives some support. In other words, this is full of politics. The measures announced to a subdued House of Commons still included borrowing an extra £300 billion over the next 5 years, which combined with rotting in interest rates will have dramatic consequences. This year alone, borrowing costs on the nation's debt will rise to £120 billion. That's 5% of gross domestic product and 12% of government receipts, a burden not seen since statistics began back in 1956. It also exceeds the level of government department spending on everything except the National Health Service. Over £300 billion has been added to the planned borrowing over the 5 years, and effectively higher rates have added an extra bill to the nation's £2.5 trillion debt pile, which Britons will have to cover. We've been living in a false paradise for many years, said David Miles, head of economic forecasting at the Office for Budget Responsibility, the independent fiscal watchdog. Until recently, people were willing to lend to the British government and other governments and lose 2% a year. The new reality is it will be more expensive for governments to borrow. Now, Hunt sought to place the blame for the UK's ills on Putin's war in Ukraine and unprecedented global headwinds, which have helped drive inflation to a 41-year high and forced the Bank of England to boost rates to 3%.
I start with stability. Mr. Speaker, high inflation is the enemy of stability. It means higher mortgage rates, more expensive food and fuel bills, businesses failing and unemployment rising. It erodes savings, causes industrial unrest and cuts funding for public services. It hurts the poorest the most and eats away at the trust upon which a strong society is built. The Office for Budget Responsibility confirms global factors are the primary cause of current inflation. Most countries are still dealing with the fallout from a once-in-a-century pandemic. The furlough scheme, the vaccine rollout and the response of the NHS did our country proud, but they all have to be paid for. The lasting impact on supply chains has made goods more expensive and fueled inflation, and this has been worsened by a made-in-Russia energy crisis. Putin's war in Ukraine has caused wholesale gas and electricity prices to rise to 8 times their historic average. Inflation is high here, but higher in Germany, the Netherlands and Italy. Interest rates have risen here, but faster in the US, Canada and New Zealand. Growth forecasts have fallen here, but fallen further in Germany. The International Monetary Fund expects 1/3 of the world's economy to be in recession this year or next. So the Bank of England which has done an outstanding job since its independence, now has my wholehearted support in its mission to defeat inflation, and I today confirm we will not change its remit.
But don't talk about the ultra-low interest rates from the Bank of England through COVID and the massive government stimulus, both of which were highly inflationary in their own right. Of course, everybody wants to sheet the blame on other people, but the truth is that poor bank policy and government policy over the last 3 or 4 years has laid a nasty bear trap for the economy as rates rise. The recession is likely to be nasty, and Hunt made use of the wiggle room afforded by his and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's perceived fiscal credibility. Now, it's worth noting that the fear was that Hunt would feel compelled to front-load fiscal consolidation, amplifying the misery caused by the energy crisis. But he extended energy support and provided further funding for health and education. Yet the Office of Budget Responsibility forecast showed that the structural change in the public finances driven by debt servicing remains in the fiscal year 27-28, while inflation and growth are expected to have returned to more normal levels. But then the OBR forecast this just a couple of years ago, and they've been pretty wrong most of the time.
I understand the motivation of my predecessor's mini-budget, and he was correct. He was correct to identify growth as a priority. But unfunded tax cuts are as risky as unfunded spending, which is why we reversed the planned measures. As a result, government borrowing has fallen, the pound has strengthened, and the OBR says today that the lower interest rates generated by the government's actions are already benefiting our economy and public finances. But, Mr. Speaker, credibility cannot be taken for granted. And yesterday's inflation figures show we must continue a relentless fight to bring it down, including a rock-solid commitment to rebuild our public finances. Richard Hughes and his team at the OBR today lay out starkly the impact of global headwinds on the UK economy, and I'm enormously grateful to him and his team for their thorough work. The OBR forecast the UK's inflation rate to be 9.1% this year and 7.4% next year. They confirm that our actions today help inflation to fall sharply from the middle of next year. They also judge that the UK, like other countries, is now in recession. Overall this year, the economy is still forecast to grow by 4.2%. GDP then falls in 2023 by 1.4%, before rising by 1.3%, 2.6% and 2.7% in the following 3 years. The OBR says higher energy prices explain the majority of the downward revision in cumulative growth since March. They also expect a rise in unemployment from 3.6% today to 4.9% in 2024, before falling to 4.1%. Today's decisions mean that over the next 5 years, borrowing is more than halved. This year, we're forecast to borrow 7.1% of GDP, or £177 billion. Next year, 5.5% of GDP, or £140 billion. Then by 2027-28, it falls to 2.4% of GDP, or £69 billion. As a result, underlying debt as a percentage of GDP starts to fall from a peak of 97.6% in 2025-6 to 97.3% in 27-28.
It's not just the scale, but the speed at which interest rates have risen, have pushed up costs, and that should be a warning to future chancellors, said the OBR chairman Richard Hughes. Former Chancellor George Osborne feared precisely this when he embarked on an unprecedented round of austerity back in 2010, because the concern is that letting debt run too high would punish the country when interest rates eventually started to rise after the financial crisis. Sunak echoed those concerns when he was Chancellor. The politics facing Osborne, who frequently blamed the previous Labour government for the state of the nation, was very different to the challenge facing Hunt and the ruling party now. Even as Sunak's Tories try to duck responsibility, they're undermined by the fact that Hunt's package is in part paying for the economic turmoil of Liz Truss's 7 weeks in office. Having reversed a £45 billion of unfunded tax cuts, Hunt's plans means there has been a £100 billion swing in policy measures in less than 2 months under the same Conservative government. So the question is, are they good with money? Languishing 20 points behind the Labour opposition in the polls, some Tory MPs worry the dire economic picture presented by Hunt means they have little chance of turning their fortunes around before the next general election, which is due in just a couple of years' time. Their fears are actually well founded, given voters typically don't reward governments that leave them worse off. Labour's Rachel Reeves, who shadows Hunt, was quick to declare the Tories had surrendered their traditional role as the guardians of economic prudence, yet she sensed the delayed pain was an election trap for her party. Anyway, households are set to suffer a record 7% slump in disposable income over the 2 years in inflation-adjusted terms, wiping out 8 years of growth. They will still not have reached the pre-pandemic levels in the fiscal year 2027 to 28. The sharp and sustained downturn in people's living standards will now define the rest of the 2020s, Matt Godwin, Professor of Politics at the University of Kent, said. The roaring 20s, predicted by some economists after the pandemic, are rapidly turning into the ruined 20s, he said. Now, it's true Hunt did try to shield poorer Britons from the budget fallout while helping them with the cost of living. What he called a balanced approach imposed tax rises on wealthy households and those businesses benefiting from high energy prices. At the same time, the national living wage will rise while pension and welfare payments will increase in line with inflation. Even so, the hit to households, despite a total of £100 billion of support in energy bill subsidies and grants, will deepen a recession forecast to last until the end of 2023, causing output to contract 2% and 500,000 jobs to be lost. Were it not for the measures to protect households, the economy would have shrunk 3%, the OBR said. Yet Hunt's decision to delay the onset of real austerity until 2025 had more than a whiff of politics and could yet undermine his primary goal to reassure investors that UK finances are stable. The difficult decisions on cuts to public services were effectively delayed until after the next election, due no later than January 2025. And Hunt ultimately plans to take £36 billion from government spending by 27-28. Some of the measures look politically difficult, if not impossible, such as a 23% increase in fuel duty, which is due to kick in from March next year. That was included in the OBR forecast, but not mentioned by Hunt in his comment statement. The issue is toxic among many Tory MPs, of course. Chris Sanger, UK tax policy leader at accounting firm EY, called it a manana budget, while the OBR's Hughes questioned whether Hunt's promises would ultimately be kept. Delaying all of the difficult decisions until after next general election does cast doubt on the credibility of those plans, said Paul Johnson, director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. The tighter spending plans post-2025 in particular may stretch credulity. So you can see here the problem they've got. They've got a massive debt burden and high inflation. They're needing to put interest rates up to try and contain inflation, but they also have significant debt, which means that the cost of debt is rising. They are backed into a corner and they have a structural deficit and no way to pay it off. So their only solution is to put taxes up by lifting not the rate of tax, but by allowing the tax band to drift higher thanks to inflation, and postpone for as long as possible the tough decisions that they need to take. Now, here in Australia, we have the same structural deficit. We have strong inflation, and we also have a rising cost of debt. So I'm going to suggest to you that what we're seeing in the UK is potentially a harbinger of some of the difficult discussions that we're going to have ahead in Australia, because we are spending beyond our means, and at the moment the cost of debt is rising significantly. In fact, it is fast becoming one of the biggest drains on the economy. Now, of course, we are different because we have the resources sector and China. But it's worth knowing that resources prices are falling, and China is not necessarily immune from an economic slowdown, partly thanks to COVID and partly just because of where they are on their own economic cycle. So we should take some object lessons here as to what Australia needs to be thinking about. I wouldn't be surprised to see some similar measures coming through in the next year or two. Meanwhile, of course, inflation continues to rage higher, despite the fact that yesterday unemployment in Australia dropped a little, but that was more to do with the fact that less people were ill and back at work, and the fact that the rotation of the different samples this time didn't distort the numbers so much. So you really can't make much of the employment data in Australia, in my view. But the underlying takeout here is that households in the UK and households in Australia are going to face a very significant crunch, not just over the next few months, but over the next few years. And it's worth factoring that in if you're making any big financial commitments or decisions, particularly, for example, getting a big mortgage, because rates are going to stay high and household pressures will continue to rise. Now, if you're buying your home in Sydney's contentious market, you don't need to stand alone. This is the time you need to have Edwin from Ribbon Property Consultants standing alongside you. Buying a property is both challenging and adversarial. The vendor has a professional on their side. Emotions run high, price discovery and price transparency are hard to find, and then there's the wasted time and financial investments that you make. Edwin understands your needs, so why not engage a licensed professional to stand alongside you? With RPC, you know you have experience, knowledge, and master negotiators looking after your best interests. So shoot Ribbon an email at info@ribbonproperty.com.au, and if you use the promo code DFAWTW/Martin, you can get a 10% discount offer. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.